Yeah, in my opinion, the single most important event that took place yesterday, the one that is actually going to shape the geopolitical environment, both in Ukraine and the Middle East, and in the West's relationship with China, didn't take place in Ukraine, Russia, the Middle East, China, or the Pacific. It took place in the United States, where Donald Trump won an overwhelming victory in the Republican primary in South Carolina. Well, I've been saying for some time that it would be a settled thing if Donald Trump won in South Carolina, which was, of course, the home state of his challenger, Nikki Haley, of which she was at one time governor. In fact, I believe I'm right in saying that she was governor of South Carolina up to the point where Donald Trump himself actually selected her and appointed her UN ambassador in his administration. Well, Trump did win in South Carolina, and by an overwhelming margin, 60% to 40%. And frankly, if Nikki Haley is not able to dent him there on her own home ground, in a state which she presumably knows very well, and where people know her, and where she presumably has friends in the local Republican Party, then I'm unable to see where exactly she can win. So it seems to me that, to all appearances, Trump is now the Republican candidate for the presidency in November. Of course, there's always the potential for the unexpected. It could be that the Supreme Court of the United States takes the absolutely bizarre decision, for example, to support Colorado's decision to disqualify him from participating in the Republican primary in that state and ultimately in the election, and that then leads to a cascade of other states doing the same thing. All the indications are that the Supreme Court of the United States is going to do the opposite. And then, of course, it could be that one of the, I think I've lost count of how many cases have been brought against him, that they might result in him being derailed in some way politically. I can't imagine myself that this is possible. He won this decisive victory in South Carolina straight after the, I think, astonishing decision we got in New York, which I have, in the case brought against him in New York, on the property valuations, which I discussed recently. So I can't see myself how any of these things are going to change the outcome now. And the important point to say is that since Donald Trump is now certain to be the Republican candidate in November, at least that is the calculation all Republicans in Congress and elsewhere are making, that is going to further solidify the Republican Party behind him. Every representative in Congress, in the House of Representatives, knows that Trump is representing the Republican Party in the election, and that if he wins the election, he will be president of the United States. And in a system so constructed around patronage as the American political system is, it seems to me that every Republican representative in the House of Representatives will now be calculating not how they can cause problems for Donald Trump, but how, on the contrary, they can ingratiate themselves with him. And I think this makes it most unlikely now that they will go against his will on issues like the border, or aid for Ukraine, or policy in the Middle East, or in the China, or in relations with China, or in any one of these matters. Now, on some of these issues, I'll be straightforward. I'm not entirely clear what Donald Trump's policies are, but on Ukraine at least, they are crystal clear. He is strongly opposed to further aid for Ukraine, and I would have thought this will crystallize the position, not just of Speaker Johnson, but of the vast majority of Republicans in the House of Representatives in opposition to it as well. And that, of course, has an immediate impact on the progress of the war in Ukraine. Now, following on from this, there have been two very interesting articles, in some ways diametrically opposed to each other, one in the New York Times, one in the Wall Street Journal. There have been other articles as well, but I'm going to focus on those two. The one in the New York Times, perhaps in some respects, the more interesting of the two, by David Sanger, by Stephen Erlanger and David Sanger, by people who I understand are connected to the Council for Foreign Relations. They are saying what is, I think, the irrefutable and straightforward truth, that the sanctions war against Russia has failed. The Washington Post has had another piece, for example, suggesting that the latest round of sanctions that have been ordered against Russia, both in the United States and in the European Union, are unlikely to impact on the Russian economy in any significant way, which, by the way, begs the question of why, in that case, are the Western powers still unrolling these sanctions. It is making less and less sense, and is becoming, I think, more and more exasperating for more and more people around the world. But anyway, Erlanger and Sanger say that the sanctions war, to all intents and purposes, has failed. They're talking about the growing momentum of the Russian military in the conflict in Ukraine, and they are doing that which the Council for Foreign Relations has been trying to do well since the spring of last year. It's been trying, arguably even earlier actually, since the winter of last year, it's been trying to get the administration to start thinking practically about the realities of Ukraine, about the conflict there, and it is trying to get the administration to start to address the question of peace in Ukraine, of some kind of negotiation which is based on some acknowledgement of the realities. Now, this article, I think, has been somewhat misconstrued because it talks about an assessment by General Cavoli, the NATO military commander in Europe, who's of course a US general. Cavoli has apparently said that this has to be a year when Ukraine remains on the defensive, a year of consolidation by Ukraine and build-up by Ukraine, and that possibly that may open up the route for Ukraine to go back on the attack and achieve victory in 2025. And many people, I think, read this article as setting out that as the preferred policy of General Cavoli himself and of the two authors of this article. I don't agree. Having read the article myself, that is not the impression I get. The point is that General Cavoli is referred in this article as having given a bleak and pessimistic assessment of the situation in Ukraine, and about having referred to this possible way forward, the consolidation and defense this year, the Ukrainian offensive and victory next year as the best possible case. Now, in my opinion, that is not suggesting that the authors of this article think that this is what will happen. If you read the article in its totality, it seems to me quite clearly that they don't believe it will happen. And if you read their words closely, it is fairly clear to me that they don't think that General Cavoli thinks that it will happen, and that it is, in fact, what he said in that bleak assessment which supposedly he gave. So this, again, is an example of an article from the, I won't call them exactly realists, but from the slightly more connected to reality people within the Council for Foreign Relations. They're capitalizing on the defeat of the Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka, the enormous shock that this has caused, to try to get people in the administration to see sense. But of course, they represent only one faction in the American government, in the vast and incredibly complex political system in the United States. And for that, we need to go to another article, this one in the Wall Street Journal, because this gives us the radically different perspective, which is the perspective of the administration, at least in my opinion, of the president himself and of his key advisors, Jake Sullivan, perhaps Tony Blinken, though I get the sense that sometimes in the dark watches of the night, he's perhaps the one person within the higher leadership team through to whom reality sometimes dawns. And of course, the even more hardline figures like Victoria Nuland. Anyway, what this Wall Street Journal article is saying is that the administration is in effect ruling out negotiations with the Russians until after the November election. And that the plan is to hold out grimly and then prepare to go back onto the offensive in 2025. Now, that brings me back to General Cavoli, because what General Cavoli is trying to say is, look, this is the administration's plan, hold out in 2024, launch a new offensive in 2025, win the war in that year. And what Cavoli is saying is, no, this is not necessarily a practical outcome to the war, practical prescription for how the war will shape out. It is the optimal one. It is the best possible one if all sorts of things, other things happen, which make it come to pass. But I suspect this is what the leaders of the administration, the president himself, first and foremost, he's spoken incredibly crudely about President Putin, for example, dropping again a hint of his enormously angry feelings about Putin, his extreme loathing and dislike of Putin. Comments which, by the way, Putin, in his usual courteous and polite way, simply batted off. But anyway, this is the approach of the president. This is the approach of Jake Sullivan, of Victoria Nuland. This is what they're all telling each other. We go onto the defensive. We use the time to build up these great iron triangle defense lines that I talked about in my program yesterday in Kryvyi Rog, in Zaporozhye, and in Dnipro. And then in 2025, when the Russians are exhausted and when our own supplies of weapons have finally cranked up to the level that we need, then we go on the attack, and then we win. I think this is what these people are saying to each other. And when the administration says that there will be no negotiations with the Russians until the November election, what they are in effect trying to convey is that what is keeping the Russians fighting and advancing is the hope of a Donald Trump victory. And that the only way to get the Russians to accept that they're going to lose the war is to re-elect Joe Biden, because at that point, supposedly, the Russians will say to themselves, well, our big hope was Donald Trump, and, well, the Americans are now building up their weapons. And we're not winning in the Ukraine, at least not as fast as we would like. And we can't win now because we got 4 more years of Biden ahead of us. And so let us come to peace on the terms that the administration and Zelensky want us to do, which is essentially total capitulation, withdrawal of all our forces from Ukraine, payment of massive reparations, all those kind of things, abandonment, in other words, of Crimea and Donbass. And then, of course, that's what the administration says will be achieved, provided Joe Biden is re-elected in November, President of the United States. And I think also that this other article in the Wall Street Journal is in effect telling us that the administration has probably quietly come round to accepting that it is not going to get its $61 billion aid package through Congress. It doesn't believe that aid package will be voted through. Further funding and military support for Ukraine will have to wait until after President Biden is, or so they hope, re-elected in November. I think this is magical thinking, to go back to what was said in another article in the Wall Street Journal some months ago. Magical thinking at an extraordinary level. But as I said, I suspect it is the predominant thinking within the government, the higher levels of the government of the United States. But anyway, there we are. I wonder what people in the Pentagon are making of all of this. Some of them must be becoming increasingly exasperated at the way in which the administration continues to want to double down and then triple down and then quadruple down on Ukraine. It's clear to me, if you go back to that article in the New York Times, that they are deeply skeptical about European claims to be able to crank up military production to meet Ukraine's needs. I agree with that, by the way. And I suspect people in the Pentagon are becoming increasingly concerned by the president's personal fixation with Ukraine. But for the moment, at least, discipline continues to hold. The doubts are spreading. The Republican Party seems to be, or so it seems to me, now drifting into outright opposition. And we'll have to wait and see whether anybody within the administration, within the United States government, eventually decides that enough is enough and decides to come out and talk openly about the disaster that is starting to develop in Ukraine itself. And disaster it is. Now, I have been getting more reports. I've been reading all the various reports from the battlefields over the last 24 hours. And I'm going to say straight away that obviously there is fog of war. There is a great deal of uncertainty sometimes about what is happening, but it's also the case that we are getting a great deal of information, except, surprisingly enough, from the Russian Defense Ministry, who, perhaps sensing that things are now going very much in their favor, are holding back on providing announcements. Anyway, let's just go quickly over recent events. So if we go to Avdiivka, as I discussed in the program yesterday, the Russians have captured 3 important villages there, Stepovoye, Lastochkino, and I suspect that they've also captured Sievernaya. There's been some attempts to argue and push back against that, but it looks to me as if Sievernaya almost certainly has come under Russian control. If the Ukrainians have pulled out of Lastochkino, it suggests strongly to me that that must be because the Russians also have overrun Sievernaya itself. Now, as always happens, there's always a short pause when villages like this are taken. The Russians then have to recalibrate their artillery, their bombs, all of those things. But it looks as if the Russians are now planning to advance on Torninka from Sievernaya, which would be potentially another lost village for the Ukrainians, but also the loss of more communications lines further, and the ultimate collapse of whatever Ukrainian defense line the Ukrainians are trying to create in this region. And it looks as if the Russians might also be planning to advance northwards from the coke factory and from Lastochkino towards Berdichi, which is probably also now coming under attack from the east. The Russian Defense Ministry, however, as of this time, is telling us nothing about any of this. They've not confirmed, for example, that Lastochkino is under Russian control, though there are multiple pictures now of Russian soldiers with flags in every part, as far as I can tell, of Lastochkino. They're still holding back on confirmation of this, probably because, as far as they're concerned, operations in this area are still underway and the Russians are still advancing. And that's already dramatic enough, but we've heard very dramatic news from 2 other places. The Russians now, again, we've had ample video confirmation of this, control the southern part of Rabotino, that tormented village in Zaporozhye region, which the Ukrainians struggled and lost so many men and machines trying to capture. The latest reports suggest that the Russians don't control the whole of Rabotino. They control roughly half of Rabotino, perhaps the bigger half of Rabotino. It seems there are still some Ukrainian troops trying to hold out in the northern buildings of this village. I remember, by the way, from the summer fighting, that the further north, the northern parts of this village are rather thinly built up. So we're probably looking at Ukrainians trying to hold out in some of the shattered buildings in the north, interspersed amongst what are actually fairly wide fields. The suggestion is that the Russians might need to clear mines in the area, some of them perhaps mines that they planted themselves in order to drive the Ukrainians out, quite plausible. And anyway, it's clear that Rabotino is hours away from being fully secured by the Russians, coming back fully under Russian control. Now, this is interesting because For a while, it looked as if the Ukrainians were going to try to put up a fight for Rabotino. Of course, Zelensky himself went there a couple of weeks ago. It seems that Ukrainian defenses in Rabotino collapsed. There's talk that the Ukrainian soldiers went into a chaotic retreat again, though this time they were given time to regroup in the north because, as I say, the Russians paused. Perhaps the Russians were surprised by the speed of the Ukrainian collapse. I don't know. But what I will say is it does look as if Rabotino is on the verge of being captured. Most commentators assume that it will fall fully under Russian control within the next 24 hours. And of course, when that happens, that will be a psychological blow for Ukraine. After all, it was the place where Ukraine claimed, as I so well remember, at the end of the summer, or the beginning of the autumn, that it had made its big breakthrough, the breakthrough that would open the way to the Black Sea and to the Sea of Azov, taking in places like Tokmak and Melitopol on the way. I can remember interviews with General Tarnavsky of the Tavria group of the Ukrainian army. Gave these interviews to the Western media the end of August, early September, talking about how much easier the advance, the offensive would become now that Rabotino supposedly had fallen. Well, that was then. We're now where we are. It looks as if Ukrainian control of Rabotino, which was always, as I understand it, pretty tenuous, has now collapsed, and the Russians are back there again. And the Russians reportedly have also very heavily bombed Orekhov, which, to be clear, is just a dozen kilometers from Rabotino. When the Ukrainians launched their offensive in June, the armored forces that advanced towards Rabotino were expecting to storm Rabotino on the very first day of the offensive. So it trundled from Orekhov towards Rabotino, expecting to be able to capture that village on that first day. Instead, as we all remember, the tanks, the Leopard 2s and the Bradleys and all of the others got caught up in the minefields and were picked off by hunter-killer teams of Russian anti-tank soldiers working in the minefields, knocking out Ukrainian tanks. And of course, as I also remember, Kamov 52 helicopter gunships were also very busy operating, knocking out these Ukrainian tanks on those hot summer days. But anyway, that was then, as I said. The point is that Orekhov is close to Rabotino. I presume most of the minefields have now been cleared by the Ukrainians themselves. Doubtless there are still mines there, but it looks like the way is open if the Russians want to seize it, to advance towards Orekhov itself, the main supply base used by the Ukrainians for their summer offensive. Of course, if Orekhov falls, it will be another big shock for the Ukrainians. And to be straightforward about it, I don't see why it would not be possible for the Russians to capture Orekhov if they put their mind to it now. So, bad news for the Ukrainians on that front. Bad news also right up in the north. We've had a kind of operational pause in the Kupiansk-Liman area now for about 2 weeks. But yesterday there was an unconfirmed report that the Russians carried out a reconnaissance in force towards the small town of Terny on the Zherebets River in the Liman area. The Russians advanced. This is a Russian scouting party advanced. They reached Terny itself. They actually entered Terny, apparently unopposed. There were no Ukrainian soldiers resisting them there. For a few hours, they occupied apparently half the town, small town, and then, as they'd been ordered to do, they pulled back. A reconnaissance in force, which again appears to show how weak and disorganized Ukrainian defenses in this area are. And the fact that the Russians are launching these probing attacks and are achieving these results strongly suggests that over the next couple of hours, the Russians will launch their much anticipated attack on Terny. If it falls, the Ukrainians no doubt will try and send some reinforcements to Terny after these events. If it falls, the Russians have a foothold on the Zherebets River. That potentially opens the way to Liman. It's widely acknowledged that the other Ukrainian-held villages on the east bank of the Zherebets River are undefendable. And, of course, the Russians are not only in a position to take Liman, but they would be able to advance more easily further north in the Kupiansk area. And there appear to be growing alarm and concern spreading within Ukraine, and it must be said, amongst some Western commentators as well, that the Russian build-up around Kupiansk looks like it's enormous, and that with Terny captured, with the Russians in control of the Zherebets River, Kupiansk itself will fall, opening the way to ETHEREUM and potentially Balakleia further west, the towns the Russians abandoned during Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022, but also potentially opening up the possibility of a Russian advance north from Kupiansk towards Kharkiv. And there are multiple reports now, including some statements from a senior Ukrainian official. Well, if I may say, first of all, the chief of staff of the Azov Brigade, the 3rd Assault Brigade, said that Ukraine lacks the men to defend even big cities like Kharkiv and Kiev if the Russians put their mind to it. Anyway, there are multiple reports that the Ukrainians themselves are becoming increasingly nervous about their hold on Kharkiv. If Kupiansk falls and the Russians are able to advance on Kharkiv from the south, they can of course also advance on Kharkiv from the east, from Belgorod. And there are lots of rumors, never easy to confirm, that there's some kind of Russian build-up in the north as well, and that the Russians could push towards Kharkiv from the north, also from the Sumy-Chernigiv area. Simplicius the thinker, in one of his latest pieces, says that the Russians are evacuating villages along the border, the northern border with Ukraine in the Sumy Chernigiv area, and he thinks that might be consistent with the sort of steps the Russians might take in advance of a Russian offensive in this area. I'm going to say straight away that the Russians have been signalling for some time that they do intend to capture Kharkiv region. Putin has talked about the need for the Russians to create a buffer zone to protect towns like Belgorod, and Kharkiv region would be the obvious place to establish that. However, it's important to say that the Russians have never elaborated or made clear on their plans, but one way or the other, if the Russians do launch these multiple offensives, and we'll see whether that does indeed happen, and if they do capture Kharkiv, well, that will be an absolute disaster for Ukraine. It's Ukraine's second biggest city. It's a Russian-speaking city. It supported President Yanukovych's Party of the Regions in multiple elections. It's unlikely its people would want to return to Ukraine. That is my own personal view. And it would be, as I said, a disastrous situation for Ukraine. Anyway, the raid on Terny might be an indicator of things to come. We shall just have to wait and see. But whatever, the fact that the Russians are able to launch operations like that doesn't speak well for Ukraine, for the prospects of Ukraine. And meantime, there is massive bombing underway by the Russian Air Force of Ukrainian positions in many parts of the front lines. They're continuing to bomb heavily Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region. They're bombing Orechov heavily, as I've said. They're also bombing Ukrainian positions in the villages to the west of Avdiivka, where the Russians are conducting their offensive. And they're also now intensifying their bombing on Krasnogorovka, this village, this small town to the north of Avdiivka. And I have to say the pictures of the bombing of Krasnogorovka are very dramatic. It looks as if very heavy bombs indeed are being used in this bombing. And it's more than just a bombing, it's a pounding. It looks like Krasnogorovka is going to be shattered. And all of that, again, points to another Russian offensive towards Krasnogorovka, where most reports say the Russians already control some streets in the south. Anyway, it suggests another major Russian push towards Krasnogorovka, which would collapse Ukrainian positions in this part of Donbass, would open the way to Kurachovo from another direction, and it would have an effect on Ukrainian positions all the way south towards Vuhledar, as I've discussed in many programs before. Anyway, that is how it all looks to me. To say it again, I am taking all this information from other sources, from Slavyangrad, from Simplikis the Thinker, from the Military Summary channel, from various Russian telegram channels, from Ukrainian reports as well, from Valterson. There is a general consensus and agreement as to what is happening. Even Western reports appear to acknowledge this. And one cannot help but contrast this Russian offensive, because that is what it is, even though it is only being conducted with a small fraction of the Russian armed forces. And this, again, needs to be re-emphasized. The effect of this offensive, the way in which the Russians have been able to capture important, heavily fortified towns like Marinka, Avdiivka, perhaps soon Krasnogorovka, how they've been able to push forward towards the Zherebets River, how, again, lots of reports that they're now well on the way to the final capture of Ivanivska in the Bakhmut area, how they're able to do and achieve all of these things in contrast to the way in which the Ukrainian offensive of the summer came to a shuddering stop within the first weeks. And just to make a few further observations about that offensive, it's important to stress again that there's been a lot of talk about the importance that the huge fortified lines, the Surovikin line, which the Russians created, it's important to stress that in no part of the area where the Ukrainians launched their offensives were they even able to reach the main fortified positions of the Surovikin line, except briefly in the area to the southwest of Rabotino and near Verbovoye, and of course they were stopped there. They were never able to launch real attacks, sustained attacks on the Surovikin line itself. When people in the West talk about the need for Ukraine to create fortifications analogous to the Surovikin line, something which, as I've said many times, even if one discusses the Iron Triangle that I talked about yesterday, that the Ukrainians might create along the Dnieper, it's important to stress that there's a general assumption that has taken hold in the West that it was the fortifications of the Surovikin line which defeated the Ukrainians. As I've discussed many times in many programs, and as the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has confirmed in multiple briefings which he has publicly given to Putin, the reality is that in no part of the front lines were the Ukrainians actually stopped fully at the Surovikin line, because they never reached it, not to any significant extent. In every place, they got held down in the various, in the area, the zone of control that the Russians typically establish north, well, ahead, some kilometers ahead, in their along their main fortifications. And by the way, I talked yesterday about this report that's appeared from a Russian think tank, a Russian Defense Ministry think tank, comparing the defeat of the summer offensive to the Battle of Kursk of 1943. That report, by the way, also says that the attempt by the Ukrainians to establish their bridgehead in Krinky and to advance towards Crimea from that bridgehead, that was absolutely part of the offensive, and it must be understood in the context of Ukraine's summer offensive. And the fact that it has failed, that the Krinky bridgehead has been destroyed, basically what that means is that every part of Ukraine's summer offensive has now failed. Just saying. So, what happens next? Well, there's a whole troop of Western dignitaries in Kiev at the moment talking about the second anniversary of the war. Giorgia Meloni is there. I wonder how some members of her government feel about this. It is known that the coalition that Meloni leads is far from united in supporting her very hardline stance on Ukraine. And I understand that sentiment in Italy is far from sympathetic to this line either. Just saying. But anyway, she is there. Ursula von der Leyen has gone there. Boris Johnson has resurfaced there. They've all gone to Kiev. We've had a speech from Zelensky, and it was an interesting speech actually coming from him, because it was a speech of defiance about Ukraine being determined and having the will to survive, which suggests that the question of Ukraine's survival is again becoming an object of discussion within Ukraine itself, or at least an object of doubt within Ukraine itself. Zelensky was talking more about survival, or so it seemed to me. The tone was more one of defiance than one of confidence in ultimate victory, even though, of course, he did say that Ukraine would nonetheless achieve eventual victory. But anyway, they were all there. Rishi Sunak in Britain has again called for the confiscation, the seizure of Russia's frozen assets. Now, the way that he's done that might imply one of two things: either that a decision has been made to do it, which will mean that it will be announced in a few hours, or that no such decision has been made and that there is opposition still from the Europeans, which cannot be overridden, and that this idea has had to be abandoned. Well, again, we're going to have to wait and see. For the record, I think the first is likely to be the case. I think that at some point within the next couple of days, maybe today, maybe over the course of next week, we will have a final, definitive announcement that the frozen assets have indeed been seized and confiscated by the Western powers through some mechanism or other, so that they can be handed over to Ukraine. I think it is an extraordinary thing to do, but there it is. The British are busy, as they always are, lobbying for it. This is despite the fact, by the way, that the political situation in Britain is terrible, that the support for the British government, for the Sunak government, appears to be collapsing electorally, and that there seems to be little enthusiasm at all for the Labour opposition, which, as I've touched on in a recent video, appear to be engaging in very complicated and rather dubious parliamentary manoeuvres in order to conceal the strengths of division within their own ranks, specifically on the Middle East situation. So anyway, all of that is continuing to go on. And I understand that there have been further studies from the Pentagon which are basically also saying that the war in Ukraine is unsustainable for the United States and for the West, that it is impossible for the United States to keep supporting Ukraine in a way that the hardliners want. It might, in theory, be possible for the United States to match or exceed Russian production capabilities, though that would require an enormous reorganization of the United States' industrial base to achieve. And, by the way, that would create a whole set of new problems in its wake. But the point that is being made, including by people like Erlanger and Sanger in that article in the New York Times, is that the United States is a superpower with multiple commitments. It cannot afford to continue to overinvest in Ukraine. And going back again to that Wall Street Journal article, one of the reasons I noticed why it gave for the unwillingness of Western governments, including, of course, the US government, but even more European governments, to give up on Ukraine, is because of the billions of dollars and euros already invested in this project. The European leaders don't want to see all that money lost, all that investment lost, which is, of course, the classic sunk cost fallacy discussed some months ago in one of his videos by my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on his own channel. The idea being that if you are losing, you don't throw good money after bad, which is the point that many people are making, but it's the one that the administration and European leaders seem determined to do. I would add that at the Munich Security Conference, this reality that the United States is a country with multiple commitments and that it cannot afford to continue to go on supporting Ukraine indefinitely at the rate in which it has been doing, that doing so is depleting US support or reducing the US's ability to provide support in other regions, which might potentially be more important to the United States, the Pacific region being one. Well, that point was made to the European leaders at the Munich Security Conference by no less a person than Senator J.D. Vance. And the Erlanger-Sanger article says that the Europeans heard J.D. Vance in stony silence. But they don't seem to be able to acknowledge the force of the point that is being made here. This project in Ukraine has, to all intents and purposes, already failed. It was based very much on assumptions that Russia would collapse under the weight of the sanctions war. That hasn't happened. The attempt to knock out the Russians militarily in the summer of last year has disastrously backfired, so that the Ukrainian military is now disastrously short of men and shells and weapons in general, and is being knocked back right across the front lines. And, well, instead of acknowledging that reality, we see European leaders still cranking up the rhetoric, saying that they must continue to support Ukraine, and responding in stony silence when people from the United States, like J.D. Vance, tell them the truth. This was a war that was only going to be won by Ukraine and by the West in the first 2 years. The Russians have now outlasted the West. The war, therefore, is now, to all intents and purposes, lost, and the sooner this fact is accepted, the better for everyone, including, by the way, the Ukrainians, it will be. I believe it was either Bloomberg or Forbes which has reported that the Biden administration, the clever people around President Biden, Jake Sullivan, Victoria Nuland, Tony Blinken, and others like that, presumably, and perhaps the president himself, are surprised and baffled by the resilience of the Houthis in the face of American missile strikes and bombing strikes. The fact that the attacks on the Houthis are not achieving the results which were expected. I have to say, I find this absolutely baffling, that they could be generally taken by surprise by something which was completely predictable and indeed predicted. But it seems that that is the case. It looks as if these people continue to live inside a bubble in which they spend most of their time talking to each other and working each other up and telling each other that they can win after all if they come up with some new cunning plan, getting shells from some mysterious third country, which is what President Pavel of the Czech Republic is saying, building iron triangle lines along the Dnieper, something of sending Ukraine ATACMS missiles, doing that kind of thing. Anyway, it seems that these people are talking to themselves, coming up with plans, unwilling to face the realities of the war, prepared to see at least Europe throw more euros at this whole war, keep the rhetoric going, blaming the Republicans in Congress that things are going wrong, refusing to recognize the scale and the catastrophic extent of their own miscalculations. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. As I said, it's clear to me that we now have, what we have evolving is a form of aggressive attrition in Ukraine by the Russians, which is now developing into an outright offensive all across the front lines, probably taking place faster than the Russians themselves anticipated, and with the Ukrainian resistance wavering and crumbling across the entire line of control. We will see what the Russians do next, but it's clear to me that for the moment at least, events are accelerating, and the Biden administration and the Europeans, let alone Zelensky himself, have to all intents and purposes now lost control. Thank you for joining me again for this program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, links under this video also. You can get all the amazing things that you will find there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.